My next project involves a sort of a bandsaw box type procedure. So first thing I need to do is make myself a chunk of wood about 6 or 7 inches long, 5 inches tall by about 3 inches thick. And I think these chunks of walnut should give me what I want. So first I'm going to rip this down on the bandsaw. And then I will joint a face. Plane it just enough to be a flat glue surface, and then glue it up. So they planed up nicely, but it's not quite enough wood for what I want. So I'm going to cut this longer piece in half, but even if you take 1, 2, 3 pieces of thickness, it's only going to bring it out to about 2.5 inches, and I want a little bit more. So I want to use as much of this longboard as I can, but I've got this big knot and this big split here, so I cut it like that. But I still want to use this piece, so I'm going to cut away the junk and then glue other scraps to it to bring it back to the needed width. Now something like this is really too short to send through the planer, but after I glue it up, I am going to have to send it through the planer. So I found a few long strips in my scrap pile. So I'm going to take this shorter piece and I'm going to glue it between these long strips so that I'll be able to send the whole thing through the planer safely. So while this first glue up dries for a little bit, let me tell you about what I'm actually building today. I made this pencil holder for my desk about 4 years ago. Now a more ordinary type of pencil holder is usually oriented vertical, like just putting a mug on your desk and dropping your pens and pencils in it, but I wanted something a little bit different. So I made this one to be oriented at an angle, so I could have it on the far side of my desk and the pens are sticking out and I can grab them. And I kind of like it, but it's a bit, I find it a bit on the small side, so I want something a little bit bigger, and I want it to orient just a bit more of a steeper angle. So I took my original shape, made it a little bit bigger and steeper, and I doodled up this sort of a plan. And the idea is that this represents the outer sides, and then this represents the cutaway in the middle. So if you can see it in your mind's eye, the base would be like that, so it will be oriented just a bit steeper. Hopefully that gives you enough to at least get started. Now with this one, all those years ago, I made the shape, and then as you can see it looks kind of rough here, because what I did is I clamped it on my drill press and I was drilling into it, which was really a bit difficult. So instead, what I'm planning to do with this one is I'm going to cut this shape out, and then I'm going to slice off the 2 sides and excavate the interior like you do with the bandsaw box, and then glue the 2 sides back on. That's what I'm planning to do. I've never actually made a bandsaw box, so hopefully it turns out. We'll see. Either way, we're having fun in the shop, so hey, we're winning there. Okay, now for a little more. And with this last piece now prepared, we're finally ready to glue our 4 pieces together, except I've decided to make it more difficult on myself. You see, this one piece has some really cool grain on it. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to put this on the outside, except there's 2 outsides. So I'm first going to take this to my table saw, and I am going to resaw this in half so that this can be the outer cheeks on both sides. So I've got my feather board set on the table saw, and I'm going to push the piece through, flip it over, and push it through, raise the blade, and keep doing that. Got a little burnt there on that last cut. I think it was just getting to be a bit much for the saw with that height. I was just doing the whole thing on the table saw. In hindsight, I probably should have just done the first few cuts on the table saw and then finished it on the bandsaw. In woodworking, there's usually more than one way to get the same thing done. But yeah, that means I need to do a little bit more planing. So these turned out fine, and I'm changing my mind again because I realized it doesn't really make any sense to glue these on the outside only to then slice them off again. So we're just going to glue up these 3 boards that make up the central core, and these will be glued on later. I got way too much glue. Dang it. The end result is a good solid chunk, but it's not a perfectly flat finish there, so it's back to the joiner to clean it up. Then afterwards we got a nice flush surface. So if I compare this chunk to the original one that I made, it's looking about the same size. But remember, I've got these 2 pieces that are going to go on it, so it's almost well, a little bit more than a ½ inch wider, which means this opening is going to be a little bit wider. And that is to say, I've been rethinking my little sketch here, and I think I'm going to make it just a little bit smaller than what I've got drawn here. So I quickly photocopied the original so that I would have the original in case this was a bad idea. But I think I'm going to cut at least a ½ inch off the top, which means that this inside is going to be a little bit narrower also, but I think that will still be plenty large. But also in regards to the original, I remembered that it dipped down on the inside, something that is almost impossible to see on camera, but this opening curves down a bit here. Have to watch out, I don't want to go too far. Actually, since the big bandsaw is best for straight lines, I'm just going to take this ruler and angle the entire lower side of the cavity down a bit. So this needs to go on here. Let me clean this up a little bit. How am I going to do that? I'm going to try to avoid the burning by doing this cut in 2 passes on the table saw, flipping it in between. And then I'm going to do much the same for the squaring up cuts for the ends. So, after the first cut, I flipped it over and then lined up the blade to the pencil line as best I could. It wasn't perfect. I needed to do a little tappity tap with the mallet and then make another cut. But fortunately, the end result was absolutely perfectly smooth. And then I applied some spray adhesive so that I could affix the pattern to the chunk of wood. This is the top of the pattern, so it kind of looks upside down, but that's the way it fit on the block the best. And so finally we're at the bandsaw part of this bandsaw box, but I'm mostly going to be using my big bandsaw because I am mostly going to be making straight cuts. So I made the first cut, but I had a bit of a camera hiccup, so I didn't actually record that one. This one was actually a freehand cut, but it turned out nice and straight. That's one of the things that you get with a nice wide bandsaw blade, and this shows finally the angle that I'm going for with my piece. I'll be using the fence for the next 2 cuts so that I get a nice straight parallel line here. And it turns out that I'm not actually using the fence for the second cut. I'd forgotten that this cut is not actually parallel to the side, so I need to freehand it. And after those first two cuts, I could make a few more straight cuts to clear out the bulk of the waste from the middle. And that's as much as I can do with that big bandsaw, so I'm going to switch to the smaller bandsaw with the smaller blade for both this curve and for cleaning up the inside here. For the curving cut, I'm careful to stay a smidge away from the line when cutting, and I'll clean it up later. And over on the spindle sander, I'm going to smooth out all the saw blade marks and refine this curve. I'm also going to take a moment and sand the inside while it is still easily accessible, because once I put the cheeks on, it won't be. What I'm first going to do is glue these pieces on, and I'm going to try to keep everything flush on this one side, and then we'll worry about making it match the shape. I want a good bond, but I don't want squeeze out. I'm going to try to be careful with how I spread this glue. I want it to just sort of be a bit set because I don't want it busting loose, but no, it's going to slide anyways. Okay, let's get on with it. Gentle pressure. Make sure the bottom is staying flush, and it is. I want to see a nice even glue squeeze out on all sides so that I know it's got a good bond. Now I'm going to flip it over and look at the underside. And now we wait. So the bottom stayed pretty flush. Now we need to get the rest of this trimmed to size. So I think I'm going to try on the bandsaw. Now the trick is from the top, I can't see where it is, so I'm going to be eyeballing this, and I'll probably sneak up on it. I'll be looking from down here. So this first cut went really well, but for the next cut I need to move the camera so that I can try to see, because it's got quite the sharp curve in there. Scraped it a bit with the blade there. I think you can see that just on the camera. So we'll have to clean that up again on the sander. But otherwise not bad. I think I might try the flush trim bit on the router to do that last little bit. I think this part I'll actually do on the table saw. So I've mounted a flush cut bearing bit in my handheld router, and I'm going to just use this as a little router table. Yeah. Little chunk got caught by the router bit and it went flying off over there. And I've been on my hands and knees, I've moved tools, I've swept. It is a tiny little chunk and I cannot find it. So I think there were two things going on there. Number one, the grain was changing direction, going from long grain to end grain. But also, unfortunately, this is a fairly old straight bit. That's just what I happen to have. The only one that I had where the bearing was on the top. I have a number of newer ones where the bearing is on the bottom, but that just wouldn't work in this situation. So if I had a brand new bit or a spiral bit, it might have gone better. Just so you know. So couple options. I could try to find another piece to match, but this is quite small and we're going sort of up on a slope here, so I'm probably going to try just hiding it as I round over the various edges. Skipping forward a bit, the good news is that I was able to clean up the bottom and get rid of that little chunk. What I ended up doing is just shaving this angled bottom off a bit, and looking all around my shop, I ended up doing some very creative blocking and arranging to make the cut on my table saw. Because of course the bottom of this project is not at a nice right angle, it's something like 30 degrees, and I needed to arrange some blocks and clamps to support and hold the piece absolutely motionless so it would not slip as I moved it through the blade. And like before, I made several repeat cuts, raising the saw blade after each one until the saw reached the maximum depth of cut, which I might add did not cut all the way through the bottom. And then after the first cut, I had to take it apart, flip it over to the other side of the blade to do the second cut. It was very nerve-wracking. The second cut was okay, but not perfectly aligned. I was able to fix that with some finessing at my stationary sanders, giving a nice flat base. But now let's move on to rounding over the edges. It was a very small roundover bit that I used, but the result is just a nice rounded over edge, which just softens everything up for something that's going to sit on your desk. And I also ran the router around the inside too, to just round over the edges. We still got a lot of sanding ahead of us. And I forgot to show this earlier. Here's the base, nice and flat and no sign of a chunk missing. One thing I did notice is that I somehow made the depth of this new one about 1/2 inch deeper than the old one. It's really visible on this pen. If you look at this pen, it sticks out about that much. And if I put it in here, it disappears almost to the tip. But that's easily fixed because I kept all the scrap pieces that were cut out when I made this gap here, and from that I made a little block which is, you know, the same grain orientation as the piece, and I sized it so it fits this way and it fits that way. And yes, I've tested that it would slide all the way in, and put a little drop of glue, and it's not going to need much, just a little dab here. I had a little block ready to shove it in there, but it just dropped nicely into position, so I'm just going to leave this for 1/2 hour to set up. Normally I'd probably take this out to the backyard and hit it with some spray lacquer, you know. Small project, quick, simple results, but it is January and it is -13 out there today, plus wind. So I don't even want to go to the unheated garage, let alone outside. So That is to say, there's nothing wrong with Danish oil. It just takes a little bit longer to dry. But, oh yeah, that looks lovely. Come back in 30 minutes and check it out. And so here's the finished project. I think that is some beautiful walnut. Turned out really nicely. A simple pen and pencil holder, and yet not so simple, or at least certainly not so ordinary. I say not so ordinary because I think most pen and pencil holders are simply vertical, or just a mug. I'm really glad I took the extra step to resaw that one piece of figured walnut into 2 cheeks, so I have interesting grain no matter which side I have, so no matter how I use it on the desk facing one way or the other, it's going to look great. That little block of wood that I glued inside the bottom really did the trick because it now nicely holds the pens so that there's a good amount protruding to make them easy to grab. Just a simple little touch that just improved it that much. Now if I compare it to the one that I made 4 years ago, you can see how this one is got a much more steeply angled entry, which is what I wanted to do for this redesign. This original one was still kind of cool, but because it's more horizontal, I just feel like the pens are just a little bit less secure, whereas here you got gravity on your side a bit more. It doesn't really matter that much, it's personal preference. I wanted to change to something like this. And speaking of the overall design, I do think it's fun to take, you know, what is a very common and simple sort of object and then tweak the design and then tweak the design even more and make it my own, make it unique and original. There were a few hiccups and roadblocks along the way, but I think that just makes the project that much more interesting. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you on the next one.